All right, let's dive into one of the most famously difficult prophecies in the entire Bible, the Olivet Discourse. For centuries, this passage has confused people, and some have even used it to argue that Jesus himself wasn't who he said he was. So what is actually going on here?
This is really the heart of the whole thing, the big question. Critics often point to Matthew 24 and say, look, Jesus made these really specific predictions about his return, and he said they'd happen soon, but they didn't. So was he a false prophet? Or are we maybe missing a crucial piece of the puzzle?
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll lay out why it's such a puzzle. Then, we'll look at the disciples' questions. That's the real key. From there, we'll see Jesus' two-part answer, uncover the kind of heartbreaking story behind it all, and finally, figure out what this ancient warning means for us today.
So what's the big deal? Why is this chapter so confusing? Well, this speech, which Jesus gives on the Mount of Olives, that's why it's called the Olivet Discourse, is just packed with this intense apocalyptic language. And it seems to jump back and forth between different kinds of events, and that's where everybody gets tripped up.
You know, this whole thing is what you'd call deeply eschatological. And eschatology is really just a fancy word from Greek that means the study of last things. You know, the end of the age, the final judgment, all that stuff. And whenever you get into eschatology, things can get complicated fast.
And here's the core accusation. Critics will say, hey, Jesus says right there in the text, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Well, it's been 2,000 years, so he must have been wrong. And you know, by the Bible's own rules, that would make him a false prophet. The stakes here are incredibly high.
But here's the thing, the key to solving this whole puzzle isn't just in analyzing Jesus' answer. It's actually found in going back and really understanding the questions his disciples asked in the first place.
So the disciples come to him and they ask what sounds like one long question, but if you look closely, it's really three separate questions rolled into one. First, when will the temple be destroyed? Second, what's the sign of your coming? And third, and of the end of the age. They probably just assumed it was all one big event that would happen at the same time.
And this is the aha moment. This is the key that unlocks the whole thing. Jesus knows they've bundled their questions together, but he doesn't answer it that way. He very carefully gives them a multi-part answer to their multi-part question, untangling the very events that they had tangled up.
Okay, so let's check out his first answer. He starts by addressing their most immediate question. When will these things be? And he's talking about the destruction of the temple that he had just predicted would happen.
And he gives them, the people standing right there, a list of very specific, very local signs to look out for. He talks about false messiahs popping up, wars, persecutions, and he tells the people in Judea to run for the hills when they see something called the abomination of desolation. He's speaking directly to them about things they or their kids would literally see with their own eyes.
And what do you know? History tells us that's exactly what went down. In the year AD 70, the Roman army came in, laid siege to Jerusalem, and completely flattened the city and the temple, just like Jesus said they would. For the early Christians who took his warning seriously, it was terrifying, but it was also a direct fulfillment of his words.
But then, Jesus makes a huge pivot. After he deals with the local judgment that was coming for that generation, he switches gears to answer their other two questions about his final, ultimate return and the end of the age. And suddenly, the scope of the conversation goes from local to global, even cosmic.
And when you put them side by side, the difference is just crystal clear. Part 1 was a local judgment in Judea. It had specific signs, and it happened in AD 70. Part 2, though, is a future event for the entire world. And about that day, Jesus says something totally different. No one knows the day or the hour. He puts a huge gap in the timeline.
Yeah, and he makes it super clear that this final return won't be some secret, sneaky thing. It's not a spiritual event only a few people in the know will see. No way. He says it's going to be as obvious and as undeniable as a bolt of lightning that flashes across the entire sky. Everyone, everywhere, will see it. And that, for sure, has not happened yet.
Okay, so understanding the timeline is one thing, but to really get what's happening in the Olivet Discourse, you have to feel the emotion behind it. This wasn't just Jesus coldly predicting the future. This was a moment of absolute heartbreak for him.
Right before this whole prophecy, Jesus just unloads on the corrupt religious leaders of Israel. And he says this, which is just, wow, it's a shocking thing to say. He's basically telling them, go on, finish the job. Your ancestors killed the prophet, so you might as well go ahead and kill me too. I mean, it is an unbelievably harsh judgment.
But then, just moments later,
his whole tone shifts. He goes from this righteous fury to this deep, profound sorrow. After he condemns them, he literally weeps over the city. He cries out with the pain of a rejected lover, like a father whose kids just refuse to come home. You can feel the grief in his words.
And that's the point we can't miss. This whole thing, it's like a great divorce. For centuries, God had been in this covenant, this marriage relationship with Israel. He was a faithful, patient, loving husband. But after centuries of unfaithfulness from their side, the relationship is now at its breaking point. And even though the judgment is just, it's still breaking God's heart.
So why are we talking about this now? What does this ancient story have to do with us? Well, it turns out it contains a really powerful and pretty sobering warning for anyone who claims to follow God today.
You know, it's really easy for us to say God is love, and that is absolutely 100% true. But we can't use that truth to invent a version of God who is just okay with sin, who just looks the other way forever. The story of Israel is this powerful reminder that God's love and God's holiness aren't in competition. They work together.
The Apostle Paul makes this exact point in his letter to the Romans. He tells the non-Jewish believers, hey, don't get arrogant. He says if God was willing to break off the natural branches, his own chosen people, Israel, because they were stuck in unbelief, what makes you think he won't do the same to you? Paul says you have to see both sides, God's incredible kindness and also his severity.
And that really leaves us with this final, challenging question to chew on. It's so easy to create a comfortable, cozy image of God that fits what we want him to be. But this story, the Olivet Discourse, it forces us to ask a tougher question. Does our modern idea of God's love truly honor his perfect, unbending holiness? That's a question worth thinking about.